So let's get rolling. Oh, there I am. Wow. Haven't been on mic in a while. I'm still a little rusty. I'm Brian Stelter, formerly of CNN, now at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University. And we are here, as you can see, to talk about how the media amplifies hate and more importantly, what can be done to address this, to fix it, to make a healthier media ecosystem. And we have three experts to talk about that with us. Right next to me here, Lauren Krapp. She is, well, you know what? We have our titles on the screen. Why don't you each give us your 10-second, credentials or bio? Not more than 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Give us your credentials.
20 seconds.
Yeah, there we go.
I'm Lauren Krapp. I'm Director of Policy and Impact at the Anti-Defamation League and our lead counsel, focusing on ways to fight hate, extremism, and anti-Semitism online, hold platforms accountable, and protect victims and targets of hate and harassment.
Jade Magnus as well, from Color of Change.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jade Magnus Ogunaki. Maybe I should move this up a tad bit. Hello, everyone. My name is Jade Magnus Ogunaki. I am Vice President of Campaigns over Corporate Power, Programs, and Research at Color of Change. And my job is all about attacking corporate power and the ways it harms our material realities every single day. Specifically, Black people, as Color of Change is the nation's largest racial justice organization that is Black-led and serves Black people. It's nice to see all of you today.
And Steve Rosenbaum of the SustainableMedia.Center. Steve, what's that?
So the SustainableMedia.Center is a year-old not-for-profit based in New York, but with a national footprint that basically came out of a whole bunch of tech, academic, and media people saying collectively, this current ecosystem as it exists today is not sustainable. And there was a debate about whether sustainability was an environmental term. And the answer we came to is, yes, it is. And the media environment that we all live in, that our children live in, that our grandchildren live in, is in dangerous shape. And so that's what we're doing.
The hashtag for this is Stop Hate Media. So let's establish what hate media is and is not. Can we give some examples? Jade, do you want to start some examples of the problem that we can all see and make very clear and vivid?
When I think about, this panel is a lot about media and also about the ways that tech intersects with media, because a lot of us get our news from Facebook and Twitter long before we open the New York Times or the Washington Post. A couple examples come to mind. The first one that really comes to mind is the summer of 2020, which is, as we know, the largest protest movement of all time. Millions of people came together to protest, to march, to take action in support of racial justice. And in Kenosha, Wisconsin, there were marches planned. At the same time, there was a military group, a militia group is the word I'm looking for, a militia group who had posted an event on Facebook. And they had invited members of this militia to come and counter-protest and to be armed, to bring guns and assault rifles to this protest. The event was flagged 5 to 10 times. Facebook refused to take the event down. There was one person who did RSVP though, and his name was Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse traveled to the event and ended up killing people who were protesting at the event. And that is a great example about not only how these tech platforms are a new form of media, they're a way that we gather, they're a way that we find community, but they're also controllers of our environment. Who's to say that if that event hadn't been on Facebook, maybe Kyle Rittenhouse wouldn't have heard of it at all. And Facebook had a duty and a responsibility as a technology company, as well as a media company, to take down what was advertised as a violent event, and they didn't. And there are families every day who are thinking about their loved ones who were killed on that day.
Lauren?
Absolutely. We are today facing normalization and mainstreaming of extremist ideologies like never before. And this started quite a while ago with InfoWars and Alex Jones and peddling conspiracy theories about tragic events like Sandy Hook. And that was on the fringes of the internet and had far too much attention. But now we are being served up hate and extremist content at the top of our mainstream news feeds. It's being discussed in newsrooms across the country. It's being legitimized in a way like never before. And it's because it's profitable. Because certainly for social media, hate and extremism and salacious content drives engagement. And we are living in a world that is optimizing for engagement, whether it's outrage or disagreement or otherwise. We're living in a world where two people with extremist ideologies who would have never met before, but were interested in the Boogaloo movement, which is an extremist anti-government movement, were connected through Facebook's recommendation algorithm to discuss Boogaloo ideas, and they met in the physical world and engaged in a drive-by shooting and killed a federal services officer. We currently have no transparency into how this happened and what Facebook's role was. That's what we're facing today.
Steve, I hate to say give us another great example of hate, but give us another example that's at the table of what we're talking about up here.
I'm going to do it a little bit differently. You know, all of us in this room have things we're passionate about. We all have hobbies. We all do things. Some of us knit. Some of us do yoga. Some of us are into metaphysical ideas. Whatever. If you look at the things you're passionate about and you track back to where your early exposure to something that you now love came from, my guess is some of it happened when you were 15. And so when I was 15, I was a magician. And I love magic. I love it to this day. So
you are going to perform for us.
And I am not a performing magician. I brought no tricks with me today. But my point is, if you think about the power and the impressionistic nature of 15-year-olds, you know, they journey into the world, they explore things, they meet people, they experiment. Today, the things that they are not only exposed to, but is driven to them, is so dramatically different than even 20-year-olds in the last 5 or 6 years. We did an hour-long conversation with Frances Haugen on Friday, and there was a 15-year-old young man on the Zoom, and he asked her about censorship. And you could tell by the way he asked the question what he was getting at. And he tiptoed around it, and he said, there are people that have things they want to put out on the internet, and that their opinions are being limited in other ways. And he then mentioned an author, and I won't say the name, and I didn't know the author, but he said, this person's book has been banned. And afterwards, I Googled it, and of course, it was this very right-wing, you know, the dangers that are facing young people as they wander in the world and are exposed to things that are algorithmically amplified and pointed at them is the thing that keeps me up at night.
Would you agree it's important to make a distinction between partisan, let's say you have a hyper-partisan content. Look, I wrote a book about Fox. A lot of the content on Fox versus what is hate, and should we put that on the table about how important it is to make that distinction, or is that not so important?
It's a great question. You're good at this, by the way. I think the problem is you can make that distinction, but who makes it? I mean, you know, I'm not sure we're ever going backwards. I'm not sure we're going to, you know, make news look more like what news used to be. I think the question is going forward, how do we figure out where the money's moving? And that's, I think, when we talk about solutions, it's who's benefiting economically from amplifying fringe ideas.
And I think while sometimes in particular circumstances we might be able to make certain distinctions, we're operating on a continuum. And so when we are normalizing extremist ideas, whether or not they get diluted, they are rooted often in hate and extremism, racism, anti-Semitism. We see conversations happening in fringe sites that reverberate on mainstream sites, right? We see this toggling back and forth. So sure, the distinction can be made from time to time, but I think it's actually important to draw the connection, because if we're not stopping the extremist content, then we're going to let it ripple into the mainstream.
Right. So conversations about shows and forums and podcasts that focus on white identity politics can be an entry point into something that is much more explicitly hateful and destructive.
Well, we know that from research that people are radicalized online. They might have an interest in something that turns into deeper and darker and more extreme because of what they're being recommended.
Right. Well, what impacts do you see, on like on a practical level, Jade, of how this actually affects people, how they communicate or don't on the internet? I mean, we've all been living in this experiment of living online for 15 so years now on social media, and maybe it doesn't have to be this way.
Living on Zoom, as we have been doing
Living on Zoom,
since
yeah.
the pandemic, having birthday parties,
Yeah.
weddings on Zoom. Lauren mentioned this earlier, but these technology companies, Facebook and Twitter, they thrive off of engagement. So it doesn't matter whether if you're a white nationalist who's spouting your ideology, or if you are someone who's contradicting or fact correcting the white nationalist ideology. The companies benefit from our engagement regardless. And so when you look at statistics like Black women are 84% more likely to be harassed on the internet, it makes you wonder if Black women's harassment is a part of the business model for Facebook and Twitter, because they are agnostic. They're not interested in ethics. They're not interested in building a sustainable media culture or a sustainable world. They're interested in making money. And so if marginalized groups are harassed on these platforms, and those same members of marginalized groups are fighting back and trying to change the narrative and providing different viewpoints and different facts, regardless, Facebook and Twitter get paid no matter what. So if that is the business model, if outrage is the business model, if anger is the business model, if conflict is the business model, where are the interventions for hope? Where are the interventions for companies like Facebook and Twitter to make a change? Color of Change has had a very interesting interaction with these companies over the years. Probably the most interesting is in 2018, the New York Times released an article sharing that Facebook had hired a right-wing PR firm to smear Color of Change with anti-Black and anti-Semitic remarks, saying that the only reason Color of Change was fighting for racial justice was because we were being puppeted by Jewish people. And because Facebook had done this and there was an expose in the New York Times, they were forced to do a racial equity audit. They ended up doing 3. And at Color of Change, we look at racial equity audits as sort of a doctor's checkup, right? The ideal racial equity audit will look at every layer of the business. So if you're looking at a company like Disney, you're looking at, are people being paid fairly? What are the editorial standards in the newsroom? Who's getting jobs? Who's getting promoted? How is that all breaking down by race and gender and orientation and a number of things? And what we found was that Facebook, like many corporations, was happy to do the checkup, but they were a little bit slower to do the follow-up that would actually result in the material changes. And so as a result of that racial equity audit, Facebook got their first ever top-level civil rights person. He's a senior vice president named Roy Austin. But Facebook is just one of these giant tech companies, and we know that they're inflicting civil rights abuses virtually every single day on the platform. Lauren was just sharing a super interesting story. I would love for you to tell about the AI.
Can I just say one thing? Because I want to make sure people can hear you. Can you flip the mic so it's not rubbing against the fabric?
Oh, yeah.
Because in the future, when we play this back,
I heard a little.
I know.
Okay.
I was like, is it my arm? Okay.
No, that's good.
Okay.
You all just shared this yesterday, I think, about a very brief interaction with the chatbot that got ugly.
That's right. I mean, in this new age of generative AI, we're interfacing with chatbots and we're hearing about ChatGPT and other forms of synthetic media. And one of my colleagues was interfacing with Replica.ai, and you can check out the conversation on our Twitter because we've tweeted it out. It took no time for this chatbot to go from, the Holocaust was certainly a lie and I am not anti-Semitic, to Jews are evil, the Holocaust was exaggerated, and I don't believe that the Holocaust existed. This happened in no time. And so we're seeing this new age of media that's peddling hate and extremism. And I think it gets back to what Jade was saying. It's good for business. It's driving outrage and it's driving clicks. And I did just want to also quickly bring up what Jade spoke about in the way of Black women being harassed online at extremely problematic rates. Communities that are marginalized and that are vulnerable are constantly harassed online. And that gets to Steve's point about censorship, which is that is another form of censorship. When you are harassed so badly online that you are pushed out of these spaces, those voices are being censored, and those voices aren't being given their time. So when we talk about censorship, I think it's incredibly important that we talk about everybody getting a robust opportunity to participate.
And can you hear me? Oh, okay. On the point of censorship, something that has come up a lot at Color of Change is the fight to protect Black history. We see this critical race theory wave moving through the nation. Something like 44 states have enacted or proposed legislation that would restrict people from learning about Black history, women's history, queer history. And we see corporations, news corporations like the New York Times amplifying people like Ron DeSantis. And so when you're talking about hyperpartisanship, is there a difference between hyperpartisanship and hate? It's not only that these are entry points for hate, it's that they're legitimized by established media publications. When Ron DeSantis wants to ban Catcher in the Rye and Solvi, which is a children's book by Lupita Nyong'o about colorism, the Republicans can certainly make an argument for why it's partisan, but we know that the base of it is hate. We know that they don't want our children to learn about Black history. They don't want our children to learn about feminism. They don't want our children to learn about queer theory, because when you learn about these things, the shame gets removed from them. And if you're ashamed, you're too weak to fight. And so they don't want our children to be able to fight. But the problem is that, when corporations like New York Times publish articles that say things like, Democrats could learn something from Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis, the same person who's trying to ban A Wrinkle in Time. We have a engagement problem. We have an editorial problem. We have a both sides problem, which is acting like both sides are enacting the same amount of harm, and we know that that's just not true.
CRT panic is a great example of this media. Great's the wrong word, but of how the media chooses what to focus on, what not to focus on, or certain outlets to focus on or not to focus on, and ultimately that's all the attention war, right? What gets our attention? What was the recent author? What was the story? Oh yeah, this is another example of all this attention suddenly on a topic. We were talking about this a couple weeks ago. What's the lesson from that episode?
The Roald Dahl, Roald Dahl's estate made a decision to go through some of his books, which are very beloved, the BFG, James and the Giant Peach, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and remove language that, referred to body weight, change some language. And that was a decision that was made by the estate. Let me tell you something, Color of Change was not asking Roald Dahl's estate to change the language in the BFG. That is not on our priorities list. But the way that the article was released is that they make it seem like there are these far left liberal forces who want to change our children's literature when nobody was even thinking about that. First of all, my daughter's 3. She's too young for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But they create these attention and click wars where you see reactionary pundits and talking heads. You see them going on about it, and your first, sort of thing is like, well, how should I defend this? Because this person that I don't like and I don't agree with is making a stand on it. When in reality, it's a total waste of our time. It's a total waste of our time to discuss it. It's not something that's truly important, and it was a decision made by the estate. People have any problems with the changing of Roald Dahl's books, they should talk to his family, not civil rights groups like the ADL or Color of Change. That is not on our priorities list.
But it's like, Steve, our attention gets hacked like this every single day. So let's get to the fix it part. Can we fix it? Can we fix it without getting off the grid entirely?
So I think we have to talk about, first of all, who has the power to fix it. So there are 2 pods of power that I think have yet to be implemented. One is all the people in this audience. I mean, all of us are, at this point, the product. None of us are paying for any of these media outlets, or very few of them. The ones that you're paying for are probably the ones that are the least extreme and the most reasonable. The ones you're not paying for are selling your attention by the pound. And the reality is, when terrible things float, when a piece of news happens, I get told about it in notifications 150 times in the morning. I don't need to know 150 times that some piece of news. I need to know 3 times or 4 times. They're giving consumers more power to control how media comes at them and how they interact with it is the first step. The second thing, and I think this is maybe the one that collectively we could start to really make change around, is there are enormous, powerful piles of money that are funding this current state of affairs. And they can all tell you, oh, we're not responsible. We just put it into the magic ad machine and it accidentally spits it out over there. But that's not acceptable. And so beginning to say to brands and media partners that we know, hey, you know what? We don't really want to fund hate. We'd like to not participate in that. And I'll just give you one last example. So when you walk the streets in New York, on every restaurant, there's a letter grade. The health department, but most of them are A's, occasionally there's a B. If there's a C or a D, you don't go in there. I mean, oh, honey, let's go to the D restaurant that has unclean kitchens and icky food. So those letter grades really matter. And at the end of the day, you know, when Facebook says to its developers, hey, we're having an economic problem, we'd like to increase engagement by, your goal, Mr. Developer, is 3% or 5%, some number. The developers sit there and they go, oh, let's see what's engaging. Oh, this terrible thing. All right, well, and they literally, they separate themselves from the dials that are amplifying hate speech. And so a lot of what I think we all feel, we talked about this a couple of times, is just transparency. That letter, I'm not talking about letter grades for me to be clear, but I am talking about transparency, which is, you know, how do I get to say, you know what, there's a stream of hate coming out of this platform. I'm going to remove it from my diet.
Can I add a third bucket to Steve's 2 buckets? Might be an unpopular opinion, but government has a huge role to play here. The laws and regulatory frameworks that underpin our online lives are from 1996. The internet looks very different now than it did in 1996. And those laws were meant to spur innovation and to ensure that small budding companies that had static websites could create and could offer us spaces. But now, as we've talked about so much, these are the most profitable businesses in the entire world. They take our data at voluminous rates, build profiles of us, and then serve us advertisements. And this machine continues to work under our 1996 framework. So we do need to compel transparency because self-regulation is not working. And we also need to change the incentive system. Right now, there's an automatic immunity from any form of accountability for user-generated content. And that may be important in some circumstances, but we need to start engaging in real inquiry about where to draw the line. Where and when can and should we be holding platforms accountable? Is it when they recommend us content? Is it when they auto-generate pages of hate, extremism, of terrorism? We absolutely need to push government to create and update frameworks.
All right, Steve, Section 230, what do we do?
So the Supreme Court had 2 days of hearings, which were kind of a shit show, which my Section 230 wise friends tell me is a good thing, because even though I think there's a lot of interest in Section 230 and changes, I don't think anyone was lobbying for that to come from the Supreme Court, including the Supreme Court, which essentially said, we have no idea how tech works. We're the wrong people to be hearing this, which is not sure why they took the case. That being said, I don't think anyone thinks, I would be willing to take a dollar bet that they're not going to spin up a judgment. That being said, you know, the debate about 230 in Washington is shockingly bipartisan. I mean, Biden, the Democrats, the Republicans all agree that Section 230 needs to be reworked in some way, for very different reasons, I might add. Like, there's no alignment on what they want to happen. And my smartest friends say to me, just be careful of what happens in the fine print. That's really the question. Is I think there will be some changes. I think there will be some liability, and you know that will make for a lot of lawsuits. But also, you know, big companies react to risk, and you know when it becomes costly for Facebook to amplify hate, and I think that's probably a good thing. That being said, I've been talking about 230 for 5 years, and nothing's changed, and you know, it's unclear to me, you know, how it will change, or whether or not the FCC is really where the internet's future belongs. And the FCC is deadlocked, so there is that.
Like status quo bias is dominating in all of this. That maybe we're too far gone.
Oh, I'm not going to ever sign off on too far gone.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. No. I think we're on day one of a really good next chapter.
Okay, we're gonna be optimistic. We're gonna have
I just want to gently push on the idea that non-experts, in this case the Supreme Court, and to your point, Steve, ADL filed an amicus brief in support of neither party, and we, gave what we thought, how we thought Section 230 should be updated in some ways, but our lawmakers and policymakers are not tech experts, and they're also not healthcare experts, and they're also not transportation experts, and they're also not aviation experts, and they're also not cosmetic company experts, and yet we have protections in place so that consumers can feel safe. And so I do think that talking point, it does have some merit, and at the same time, we can't, it works so well to stop us from any level of meaningful reform.
In tech,
That's really
especially because, again,
You're good, loud and clear.
In tech, especially because, as a Black woman, when I hear tech, I've been working in tech for years, the first thing I think is that it's just not for me, right? Tech has been coded as something that's hard and challenging and not for everyone to understand. And the truth of the matter is that the principles are very simple. If every time you went into your local Starbucks, there was a KKK meeting with people wearing hoods, you would be like, what is going on Starbucks? And if Starbucks didn't take action, you would go to your city council or your mayor and say, you have to do something about this Starbucks, because every time I go in there, I'm hearing the N word, I'm hearing the K word, I'm hearing the F word. I don't feel safe. The internet is the exact same thing. These are our community spaces for better or for worse. Like Steve said, we're not going back. We're not going back to the analog era. We're only going forward. So if we know that these spaces are not safe, and we know that these corporations who have had decades to regulate themselves and create some sort of civil rights structure and consumer protection structure that allows us to be safe on the internet, if we know that they're not going to do that, regulation has to come into play. There's really no choice. I know many of us are distrustful of the government for many reasons, but they are the only people who can come in and put forth a framework so that the internet can be what it's really used for, and so that we're not constantly being assaulted by hate every time we log on.
Think about this is like, what rights do we have as online citizens? And then what responsibilities? I probably shouldn't say this on a hot mic because it'll get taken out of context, but like if you Google my name, because I was on CNN, I got a lot of haters, and if you Google my name, you'll see Stelter pedophile, pedo, over and over and over again. And listen, I'm a public figure, fine. Say whatever you want to say, right? But what about my kids when they Google my name in a few years, right? What are their rights? What are my rights in that? And I think about that as a very practical thing about the next generations that are growing up and are going to be logging on. And how are they going to engage in this technology? And what are they going to find from the last 30 years of all the rest of us chatting on social media? Like that's what scares me, Steve.
So I'll ask a question to the audience. How many people in this audience are shareholders of Facebook? What? Actually, I am. Well, so
it's the point that we all are through our.
So how many of you have a 401k?
Right.
Okay, you're all shareholders in Facebook. You're all 401ks all have index funds. Index funds are all in the FANG stocks. Not only are you all shareholders in Facebook, but you're profiting from hate. And they had a bad quarter, so you're having a bad quarter. But that power, how we find a way to get our arms around that power, and for you to say to the Fidelities or Vanguards of the world, who are the big shareholders of a lot of those big platforms, hey, you know what? I'm curious. What you're doing about. I'm a shareholder. I'm concerned about that. Like collectively, we haven't figured out how to harness the economic power, either as the audience or as the shareholders.
These companies say they are doing enormous amounts. Maybe not Twitter anymore, but don't they claim to be taking lots and lots of action?
Always. And I will say that, Color of Change and ADL worked together in 2020 on a massive campaign called Stop Hate for Profit, where we got hundreds of corporations to pull their ads from Facebook due to the fact that, not only was this, the largest racial justice protest movement of all time happening, but Facebook still wasn't stepping up to the plate and doing what they needed to do. And so, Color of Change is running a similar campaign on Twitter right now. It's been challenging, and with Elon Musk at the helm, you just never know what's true or what's false. But one of our biggest wins that we've been able to get was talked to brands that share our values, like Seventh Generation, which is like a eco-friendly toiletries company and cleaning company, and Ben & Jerry's, who's a longtime Color of Change partner, and get them to go to Unilever and say, we do not want to have ads on Facebook, on Twitter anymore. And that's actually worked. And so what we see is that, with the corporations, it can definitely feel hopeless as someone who does nothing but corporate accountability, trying to attack corporate power every single day. It can definitely feel hopeless because particularly since 2020, these corporations have walked back every single commitment they've made any marginalized community. It's like it never even happened. But what we're seeing is that
they're afraid to take a stand now.
Are they afraid?
Is there no transparency? Is it an excuse because it's really easy and it's really good for business to put money into ad dollars on these
And
platforms?
we see like with you're talking about the pedophile thing, which I think has been one of the most disgusting and low down ways that people have mobilized on the right. It's happened really around the fight for Black history, the critical race theory thing. But when we were doing, when Ron DeSantis dropped the Don't Say Gay bill, and Disney refused to take a stand. Mind you, I had just been to a Disneyland property, and so they had a paid Disneyland Pride event. I had purchased a rainbow Pride Mickey Mouse for my daughter, and so it was very interesting to me that Disney was saying, oh, we don't want to take a stand on this Don't Say Gay bill, but they were willing to make money from queer communities. Yeah. And so, we went to Disney and we mobilized our members to send thousands and thousands of emails and calls, and we met with Disney directly. And we were able to get them to take a stand on the bill, but these corporations can't have it both ways, especially because they have political action committees. They have their employees investing money into candidates. And so circling back to the critical race theory fight, one of the things that we saw with this huge ban of, in case you guys missed it, ban of women's history courses, ban of any sort of course that talks about Black history or any sort of racial framework. One of the things we saw is that not only did Ron DeSantis make this decision, but he was backed up by the Florida State Board of Education. Who is on the Florida State Board of Education? Executives from Walmart, from AT&T. Why are these people making decisions about our children's educations? Where does it stop? Why do corporations get to say they're not going to take a stand on anything and then prop an executive up on this Florida State Board of Education and ban Black history? These things are totally preposterous.
But is the fault with companies and technology, or is it with ourselves? Ron DeSantis represents millions of conservative parents in Florida. Is the fault within ourselves?
I will say something about that, which is, sure, individuals absolutely need to take individual accountability. But let's get back to talking about how is this being normalized? Who is this being served up to day in and day out? And I wanted to talk about one more industry, which is the online multiplayer game or video game industry. Because these ideas of extremism and white supremacy are being shuffled over to our kids, to ourselves, to our neighbors. 70% of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, according that we were able to identify at ADL, were not card-carrying extremists. They were teachers, shopkeepers, hairdressers. So yes, of course individuals have to take accountability, but we have to ask how we got here, and we cannot say that it's completely divorced of how we get information, of our social media
Supply and demand, right? Supply and
Also,
demand.
misinformation and disinformation has changed the game. It's totally changed the game for how people understand elections, for how they understand issues. When Florida Don't Say Gay bill came out, Color of Change has squads. So we obviously have an online membership, but we have in-person meetings who meet quite often. And when we talked to Black folks on the ground in Florida, what we heard was that the messaging around the Don't Say Gay bill was not the banning of Black history or the banning of queer history. It was messaged to them online via misinformation as disinformation as not giving sex education to kindergarten students. And so the misinformation and disinformation game, which these media companies and tech companies refuse also to get a hold of, is changing the ways that we're engaging. When you think about Fox News and how the advent of Fox News turned a generation of retirees into crazy conspiracy theorists. You hear all of these stories about people whose parents and grandparents, their personalities, their politics changed overnight due to the media they were consuming. We're seeing that same thing happen online. How many of us have a very logical and beloved friend who, when COVID dropped, were saying some of the most ridiculous things you'd ever heard of, and you're like, where are you getting this information? Like, where are you hearing this? And they're getting it from the platforms. And we're not prepared for how misinformation and disinformation are molding our brains and our children's brains.
And platforms are aware of this. Based on documents from the Facebook whistleblower, we know that they study this, they're fully aware of it. One story, really quickly, Carol's Journey to QAnon is what it's called, uncovered from whistleblowing documents. This was a research project, from a Facebook employee, stood up a account, a mother in North Carolina, interest in conservative issues, a little bit of religion, nothing to do with, hyper-partisan politics, nothing to do with white supremacy or extremism. In 2 days, the recommendation algorithm was recommending QAnon content. In a week, Proud Boys content. So yes, individuals have accountability, but this is absolutely being impacted by this business model.
Look, I love on Twitter, it says for you, there's anti-trans content right at the top.
Exactly.
Steve, you're going to add.
So I'm going to go back to optimism. Because when I listen to us, when I put myself in the audience, I think, wow, these guys are really fired up. They're working really hard. It seems really scary and getting worse. And so I have two thoughts about that. One is, I think I've been doing a lot of reading about cigarette smoking. It's worth remembering that there was no thing that stopped cigarette smoking in the United States. There was no bill, there was no law, there was a whole bunch of stuff. There was a lawsuit, there was a 60 Minutes story, there was some packaging, there was some tax changes, Hollywood changed how they present. Like there was no single person or thing that changed cigarette smoking. The society, through a whole series of actions and a whole bunch that didn't work, said, you know what, enough. And cigarettes isn't gone, we've got vaping and all kinds, it's not a problem that's been solved, but it changed. If you look at the data that's coming out around teens and mental health, there's still people are, well, it's not quite causal, but it's close enough and getting there that you're starting to see average folks concerned about their children. And what I would say to everyone in this room and everyone that's going to hear this is, you don't have to solve the problem. It's too big and complicated. You don't have to boycott you have to do something. You have to pick the thing where and maybe the answer is when something reaches you through media that you think is inappropriate, just occasionally, like you don't have to get into Twitter wars and become because it's exhausting. And a lot of people I know, their answer is, I'll just tune out. You know what? This is so scary and hard, I'm just stepping away. I'll watch less news, I'll listen less, I'll participate less. That's not the answer. But I do think people need to be given credit for doing a thing. Picking an issue you care about, whether it's children's mental health or anti-Semitism or, Black Lives Matter or women's, pick the thing where you feel most passionate and stand up and do something. And do something that means making a donation or responding or letting a media company know you're unhappy. But collectively, we have a lot of power that I think at the moment isn't yet. Well, you feel it waking up. You feel people saying this isn't acceptable.
We're going to go to questions in a couple of minutes. Lauren, are there legislative approaches or regulatory approaches that get to Steve's optimism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Steve makes a really good point that this is a whole of society, whole of government, whole of industry problem. And so we need every stakeholder to engage in solutions. There are really important transparency bills and, in fact, laws that have been passed. ADL worked on California's AB 587. It's requiring major social media platforms to report on how they operate their content policies and enforcement on hate and extremism and disinformation. We're really careful with that. So there's some really smart bills. Like Steve mentioned, there are many areas of bipartisan consensus. There's a general agreement that we need to update Section 230, not obliterate it, not kill it, not upend it, but increase accountability in some ways. So we are absolutely tracking it. And I do have some optimism that we're moving forward. Europe is moving forward with the Digital Services Act. So we need more transparency. Hopefully, I'm going to say it's coming. We need more accountability, and I sure hope it's coming too.
Jada, yeah, Ali.
Yeah, so for the past, I guess now a year now, Color of Change has been doing this very covert work on the manosphere. And so the manosphere has come into public knowledge due to Andrew Tate and all of the his arrest and all the controversy around him. But Color of Change first entered the manosphere space due to the way that the manosphere was attacking Black women. They were consistently putting out messages through podcasts, through online communities, Discords, message boards, creating an environment where Black women were worthless, unattractive, unintelligent, and responsible for all of the woes of the Black community. And so this was a space that we engage in covertly, partly because we know that when you campaign against somebody, you amplify them. And so we didn't want these podcasts and these communities to be amplified. And so we went to every major social media company and asked them to create guidelines around this very specific intersection of race and gender. I said earlier that Black women are harassed on the internet 84% more. And we know that there are other communities, particularly Asian women are another community that faces very unique challenges. And I guess the hope came from not from Facebook or Twitter, who of course did nothing, but talking to these newer platforms like Patreon, these platforms like OnlyFans, who have really interesting and forward-thinking people in charge who are thinking about the internet in a different way, was incredibly hopeful. I've been doing this corporate power work at Color of Change specifically for 7 years. I've been engaging with Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and Google for all of those 7 years. And interacting with these new platforms that are actually money generators for people, actively compensate people for their time and their energy, unlike Twitter and Facebook, where everyone gives everything away for free. That was a really optimistic moment for me because it shows that we're not stuck to these old platforms. There are new things coming, and those new things are way more aligned in the future that we're trying to build, which is a sustainable media economy for all of us.
By the way, add to that list Roblox. Really interesting people at Roblox thinking about civil society and civic engagement and starting really young, really thoughtful, interesting folks.
Let's see if there's questions from the audience. So we have a microphone in the middle. If you want to line up, we'll see if anybody wants to jump in and go first. How do you, Jade, reckon with the reality when you take on these companies, when you take on these politicians, you're going to piss people off? And I get the sense some people don't want to be in that fight, don't want to be a part of that fight. What do you tell them?
Well, the fight's coming whether or not you participate in it or not. So pick a side. I mean, that's my thing with corporations. You need to pick a side. One of the great examples I'll say is that, we've been asking these educational material companies like McGraw-Hill, like Pearson, you guys need to take a stand and say you're not going to just ban Black history if a governor asks you to. You guys have to take that stand. They refused to take the stand. They kept all their textbooks exactly as they were, refused to make a public commitment. Then in March of last year, Ron DeSantis bans 90% of the textbooks regardless. They didn't take a stand and they still lost millions and millions of dollars in the business of Florida State. And so the fight is coming to all of us, whether or not, because it's a fight for dignity, it's a fight for humanity. And it's something that we're all involved in because we have a Twitter, because we have an Instagram, and because these are the new ways that we connect. So we're a part of it regardless.
Members of the media. Yes, Steve?
I think we should all chip in and invest and build JadeBot. Honestly, I think anyone who has these questions, we should just feed it to an AI and we can take all your language and respond to them in real time. Thank you.
AI that won't tell me Jews are evil.
Yes.
What an upgrade. Okay, we have lots of questions. Let's go right here.
Yeah, you've spoken on this, briefly, but I'm, curious as an advertiser, do you have examples of effective ways that advertisers have driven change and maybe some ineffective ways that advertisers have gotten involved?
I actually have a great example. So we talked about Stop Pay for Profit earlier, where we had hundreds of media companies and corporations pull their ads from Facebook. We did a second, more quiet campaign where we came together with a group of independent Black media companies, and we asked those companies to invest millions of dollars into those companies instead. And the results from the ad spend, believe it or not, were way better than Facebook or Twitter. They were more niche. They were more niche publications. Maybe mostly online magazines like Blue Magazine, which is for Black queer men. And so the corporations and companies were able to direct that ad spend into those smaller, more niche markets. And there's actually an organization that does it. I think it's called Independent Black Media Consortium. And so they have a list of like 300, and I'm sure there are independent media for all sort of different marginalized groups.
And just to quickly add on to that, we don't have to throw up our hands and say, this is just the way it is. You can talk to representatives at big platforms, you can pull your ad spend from them and invest in smaller publications, companies, but we should not throw up our hands and say this is the way it is, because it does not have to be that way.
I wonder if, you're seeing more and more big companies now embrace ESG. Why wouldn't one of the larger agency groups say, we're going to put together a collection of media buying strategies that are going to be less inexpensive. They're going to be a premium, but you'll be able to say to your customers, we support non-hateful media, and we'll pay a premium for that. Like, as a customer, I would like to know the brands that I trust are paying attention to where my money's going.
All right.
So when I watch a video on YouTube, even about like a mundane topic like transportation, and it's about, well-reasoned commentary on why electric cars aren't enough or something like that, I refresh and I go to my recommendations page and the title is like, electric cars are an effing scam, you're an idiot if you buy, and I'm like, okay, this is the algorithm at work, it thinks I'm interested in this, so it's giving me this. But that's because I took 4 years of computer science, I've done psychology classes. I feel like most people don't have that education to even know what algorithmically generated recommendations are. So do you think that there should be an effort, or is there an effort to get that kind of education in the classrooms, even in like elementary school, and saying, here's what an algorithm is? Like, I didn't know what an algorithm was till college, but they're so embedded now. Can we get that in the schools? Do you think that's a viable sort of a worthwhile effort? And it also seems like, while critical race theory is partisan now, I don't think anyone's going to get fired up if you say we should have better computer science in the classroom for now until it becomes a partisan topic.
And we didn't bring up media literacy, and you're exactly right. We do need to better understand our digital footprint and digital hygiene. So, yes, absolutely. I think that, the onus should be on the most profitable billion and trillion dollar companies to do more, and yet we absolutely need to educate our generation and the next generation.
I don't think most people even know how it works. To your point, to me, I didn't really know how it works until I started working at Color of Change. I didn't really think much about it. I just took the social media platforms and the internet at face value. And so I do think that is something that should be in schools. I think that's the media literacy in general. What we see is that most people's media literacy is really, really bad. Even people who are on Twitter and Facebook and Google all day, they don't know why they're seeing the recommendations that they're seeing. They don't know why, at Color of Change, we were just outraged in 2016 when you could get recommended for David Duke. He would pop up on your who to follow list. People have no idea of why that's happening, and we need another level of media literacy. When I was in school in the 90s and the early 2000s, the push was make sure, Wikipedia is not an established source, right? That was as simple as it got. And I don't think it's progressed beyond that at all. And so I think the push for media literacy is really important.
Coming at the topic from a journalistic trust, polarization, viewpoint, diversity perspective, I'm curious and given the predominance that I guess you could say the media industry is controlled and operated and membership is in the Democratic Party, what do you see either personally or structurally to create more counterpoint to avoid sort of the false confidence and straw man arguments, all the things that we as intellectuals have to do to make sure that we're not tripping over our own shoelaces, hearing too many yeses from our own crowd of people? How do you see tackling I need my adversary to find the holes, the flaws, the leaps in my arguments so that I don't go embarrass myself, don't go lose an audience, don't trigger the wrong people over the wrong reasons, et cetera, et cetera. I'd love to hear that interaction for the same thing we do in scholarly review is adversarial peer review. How do you do that from a public pronouncement, solution building kind of exercise?
I think the speed of the state of media makes that really hard.
Yes, it does.
So you're sitting there at your desk and everybody yesterday, all they wanted to talk about was SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, Silicon Valley, people pontificating blindly about what happened with no knowledge. most of the day, and maybe still today. But I would propose that we use the word news in a way that's far too casual today. And that, there are journalistic standards within news organizations, and then there's opinion, and I think that we allow the muddy web to mush them together. And I just think, when people say to me they're doing journalism, I understand what that means broadly. When people say they're doing opinion, I understand what that means. I think when people are both opinion and news in a muddy way, it becomes harder as a reader or a consumer to know where the line is between I'm stating facts and I'm evaluating the story with my knowledge. But the word that gets thrown around a lot and that I spend a lot of time on is truth, which also is not one thing. But I'll just end by saying I also think that 11, 12 years ago, the filter bubble, the Eli Pariser filter bubble book came out, and I remember thinking that was not that it was too cynical. And now sitting here today, it's the state of play. So he was right.
Can I just say, optimizing for outrage is a huge piece to the puzzle. There's 3 responses to that. 1 is operating in your own echo chamber. 2 is screaming and having a heightened sense of back and forth. And 3 is completely disassociating. And we need the 4th lane, and that's when we can have real discourse.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I am a rewired retired school librarian that co-founded Freedom Fighters, which is a grassroots group of librarians fighting to preserve intellectual freedom in our school and public libraries. And I have a comment and a question. And the comment is to your comments earlier about being a public figure and being called a groomer and a pedophile, just to raise awareness for people in this room that educators, librarians particularly, are frequently being called pedophiles, groomers, and worse on social media. And so your idea of reaching out specifically about a certain population to places like Facebook to pay attention to that, I think was a great idea for me to take forward. And then the second comment was about media literacy. I was thinking about how the librarians are a great conduit for media literacy, and sometimes in schools we're some of the more media literate folks as far as educators. And I was thinking about a model the Smithsonian has of they bring in librarians to the library, teachers into their facilities in the summer for week-long workshops, kind of embedding them in the museum. And I wondered if y'all know of any similar thing that could be done or is being done to embed educators in some social media setting so that they can really learn the ins and outs of algorithms and how social media works so that they can do a better job of teaching it to students. And I didn't know if you knew of any projects like that.
We know of some private curriculum-focused, pieces that are coming out through different universities and other academic institutions. But I think your point that this should be much more publicized and normalized is absolutely well taken, and it's a great middle ground.
I was just trying to Google to find Freedom Fighters. Where do we find it?
It's FREADOM.
Cool. Okay. No,
Freedom
right.
Fighters.
We're reading.
Yes.
We're reading. Yes.
Yes.
No, that's beautiful. There has to be a counter to this craziness. Anybody else? Let's take a couple more. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for coming. The discussion has been really helpful so far. So I work for Oregon Public Broadcasting. I'm a journalist. We do give our content away for free for anyone who wants it. But I guess my question is, social media has really torpedoed the local news industry, including, it's been really hurtful for us as well. But we're still, we still have a large audience on those platforms. Almost, I feel like a lot of local publishers at a lot of conferences that I go to are sort of addicted to the traffic. It's like if we were to give up these platforms, who would come to our websites and read our stories and things like that? And what I'm hearing from you is that the answer is not to leave those platforms, but I'm curious to hear what the future looks like, in your opinion, for local publishers who still need traffic, who still are doing the good work of journalism and want people to come read our stories, but don't necessarily have the positionality to like take stands against a major corporation like a Facebook or a Twitter without just leaving it. So I guess I'm curious to hear if there's like a post-social world in your view, or if we're just sort of stuck with these platforms and need to find better ways to engage with them as publishers. Thank you.
Well, people say the same thing to Color of Change. They say, you're fighting against Facebook every day. Why do you still have a Facebook page? Why do you still run Facebook ads? And the truth is that we are all suffering as a result of these corporate monopolies. It's impossible to have organic reach on Facebook now. If you don't put some money behind a post or a campaign, nobody's gonna see it. And that's the unfortunate reality. It's the same thing with independent media. Thank you so much for all that you do, because independent media is the way of the future. It's the only way that we're going to be able to move forward. And what we see is that when there's a dearth of independent media, elections go wrong. Disinformation populates, because if there's not a local paper that people trust, that they've been reading for forever, they turn to Facebook, they turn to Twitter, and that is not the best place to get your news. And so I would say we're in the same boat as you. We have to be on Facebook, we have to be on Twitter. These are places we have to engage if we want to bring people along on our fight for justice and to engage in our campaigns. And so I would say just keep getting as much as you can out of them.
And also pushing for our legal and regulatory frameworks to be updated. I mean, this is the problem. It's the monopolistic power of big tech. It's the surveillance level of that advertising business model. And so that needs to be pierced and chipped away. That needs to essentially crumble before we can really engage in some sort of different way. So keep doing what you're doing, and thank you. And we also need our lawmakers to step up and to change the game here.
We got two more.
Hi, thank you for all your everything for so far. So I work for a public broadcaster in the Netherlands, and I don't know what the internet rules are, because you said in the United States they are built on a framework from 1996, right? I don't know what it's like for us, but you've talked a bit about how we can hold the government accountable. And well, I, as one person, I can't change anything, of course. So I was wondering what you would advise or feel, maybe what the steps would be for a whole group of people. How can we hold them accountable? How can we do that as a larger group?
You start, Mark.
Well, I think that there's a lot going on in Europe. There's a lot of important regulation and transparency efforts at play. So I am optimistic in that sense. The Digital Services Act being one of many. But what can we do? Mobilize in groups, talk to the private companies that talk to your individual lawmakers, push them to do more and better. And also I understand the kind of frustration or the feeling of powerlessness because the status quo isn't working. So push, but also I think, Steve was mentioning, we can't burn out on this. We need our leaders to step up. And so knowing that you have to operate holding those competing truths.
And also, the EU is like light years ahead of the United States on regulatory framework for the internet. So you're in a much, much better position. But for folks in the United States, Color of Change has released something called the Black Tech Agenda. We broke it in the Washington Post. And I know a lot of people are like, okay, well, I'm not Black, so why am I looking at the Black Tech Agenda? We know that until the most marginalized people have access and freedom that nobody does. And so we have a set of frameworks, ways to contact your representatives around very specific legislation that can make the internet a better and more safe place for us. It's a roadmap and it's a guide for how we push our elected officials to take a stand on regulation. It's obviously not a very popular thing because these tech companies are investing millions of dollars into people's campaigns and into their super PACs, and so they're behind a lot of the politicians. But I would highly recommend for folks to take a look at the Black Tech Agenda. It's a really, really important framework and guide plan.
And I also quickly want to mention that allowing researchers to access better and more data can absolutely help us. They are digging into these issues as best they can right now with a lack of transparency, and they are thinking of systems for the future, and they are really putting out there a lot of great work. They need more access so they can do better and more work.
All right, our final 2 minutes. No pressure, but you're the last question.
No worries. So thinking about this from a more like hyper-local perspective and a lot less serious than the topics that have been discussed so far. I live here in Austin, and they released a vision plan for the local park here at Zilker Park, and the groups that were against it immediately came out with the sort of hyperbolic statement that they want to turn it into an amusement park, right? And so like that's this next door, everything was amusement park, no amusement park, right? You know, so I tried to sort of engage and been like, well, it's a 70-page plan. Surely there's one thing that you like about it. Can you pick one thing? Amusement park. Like, you know, one of the things was a pedestrian bridge. I was like, surely a pedestrian bridge over the creek is not controversial, right? You know, but again, it was like amusement park. And so I just sort of, my question to you is, I wonder how much of this is information overload, and we have to put things in these buckets that like, we can't think nuanced, we can't think like very specific, we have to just think in these like, you're a pedophile, like this is an amusement park, like, and this is just the way our brains are wired. And I don't know, just any input or thoughts on that?
Well, the thing is that people make money on the internet from having opinions, and that the most extreme opinions and the most polarized opinions are what generates the most clicks on either side. If you're taking if you write a nuanced tweet, that's not going to grab attention, good or bad, as much as like an extreme or as a polarized tweet. And I think there's also this push due to the internet, due to people making money on the internet. Everybody wants to be an expert on issues that they are not familiar with, they haven't read anything about. And so I would just say, you know, this is a independent thing, but we have to resist polarization in our own thinking, in our own ways that we take in information and take in news. Because especially for me as a campaigner, as someone who runs, you know, hundreds of corporate campaigns, you know, if I can't have a nuanced or objective point of view, I'm missing an intervention for a victory. And so I think all of us have to resist polarization. You know, there's so many times, for all Twitter's bad things, I still do think they're like, hey, did you actually read this article? I actually do think that's really good, because a lot of times we just read the headline. We're seeing that happen right now with the AP African American Studies course, right? Where like New York Times put forth this like crazy headline, nobody read the article, and there's no substance there, right? There was no substance in the actual fight against the course. And so we have to resist polarization on an independent level. And in our conversations, we have to resist extremism and just engaging with friends, because it's so easy to get there because you get attention for it.
We're out of time, but a sentence from each of you. We can fix it. Is that the takeaway, Lauren? We can fix it? We can fix it.
We all need to work together to fix it. That sounds cheesy, but it's absolutely true.
Okay, Steve?
I'll leave with a plug. SustainableMedia.Center. We have a newsletter. We're doing a lot of work. We'd love to have you all be involved.
Jade, we can fix it?
It's going to take a long time, but we can fix it.
It can get better? Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists.